Hi, I'm Tim Linsdau. I'm a video producer and a Christian. Today I want to talk about conservative. Let's look it up in this old Webster's Handy College Dictionary. And we're going to see what it says. Opposed to change. Moderate, not extreme. Who knew that? Protecting from loss, waste, or injury. Conservative person as a noun. The English language is all about semantics. I mean, we're full of all kinds of strange phrases. It's a huge language because we've captured language from all over. But getting back to conservative, what does that mean? And it is semantics because the way we use conservative now, in the conservative liberal battle, if you will, rages on. So it's saying almost opposed to change, and I think that's used quite a bit that way, especially in government. People will say no matter what the situation is with the government, they want to stick with it as it is. Some would call that conservative, but they're going to be supporting a certain point of view. You can have a liberal government, and those in power that are liberal, if you can, again, it's semantics, but if they support a liberal position, they may be conservative in their position on supporting their position. Then they become conservative. They start to conserve their position. So you can see how this becomes a sticky wicket, so to speak, and then another lovely English phrase. And about being conservative. I mean, look at George Washington, the founding fathers. Now, we would say they were conservative. But were they? At the time, they were controlled by a monarchy, nation controlled by a king. How much power he had in the 18th century, I'm not certain, but he must have had an effect on their government. But the people that were in America, who we are calling conservative, the founding fathers, actually became quite liberal, that they wanted to change the form of government that was ruling them, if you will. Taxation without representation. They wanted something different. They wanted to have control of their own lives. And, you know, a lot of them probably had forefathers who had actually come here before them, so a lot of them were born here, the founding fathers. So they started to feel separate, and they wanted to have their own government, their own style of living. And slowly but surely, they slowly parted from the monarchy, from Britain, and fortunately, it eventually came to war in the Revolution, and we ended up with the United States of America. But so these, what we would call so-called conservatives, became liberal in their thinking and their view. They wanted change, and they wanted a lot of change from the old ways, the old European models of monarchies. They wanted to do away with all of that and come to a thing called rights endowed by our Creator, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Actually, a pretty liberal views on their face value. So that when they started to form the government, they eventually came up with the Constitution we have today, which we would call, if you really stick to the Constitution, you'd be called a conservative today. But there's many changes we've made in that Constitution. The Bill of Rights, the numerous amendments that have been added over the years, you'd call those more liberal changes. Some would say not, because they occurred because things changed. I'm not sure about that, if things change that much in the human condition, that we're any different now than we ever were. We still have the same emotions and desires and struggles and problems as we try to perfect our lives in taking care of our families and service to others. So what does it mean to be a conservative today? Well, there's a pretty good rage going on over that. Of course, it's focused on a particular political party. The Republicans would be called conservative. But the funny thing about that is, ever since the new president came in, there's been, of course, all kinds of upheaval and so forth. But he didn't leave everything the same. He's changed a lot very quickly. Taxation, immigration issues on the border, attempting to reduce the size of the federal government. It's just a fraction of things that have occurred in a very short time. Changing the health care system. It's more like the health insurance system. My point here is not to argue one way or the other. We'd never get anywhere. It was actually a liberal approach to what existed in the government at the time he went into the White House. He started to change all kinds of things. Well, that, I think, goes against to what a conservative is. He wanted to change a lot of things. So that takes us back to the quandary of what is conservative. I was going to try to dig more into just being a conservative and talk about the liberal another time, but it's pretty hard to do, I guess. But that's my point. It's a matter of semantics. Every time we use the word conservative, what do we mean by it? It has to be used in context. If you look at the fall of the Soviet Union, those that wanted to continue communism would have been called conservative. Well, conservatives look at communism as a very radical way of life. In fact, they call a lot of liberal thinkers, they might call them communists. Well, they wouldn't be conservative in this country. They'd be considered on the left, if you will. You know, on the left, which is considered liberal. So, conservative, it depends on what the environment is. Not wanting to change, and yet we don't see that. We see a bunch of change, and a lot of change that's upset a lot of people. As laws are passed and they change and people become established with them, they might like them as is, and they don't want them changed. One of the big one, of course, has to do with abortion. As a Christian, I cannot support abortion, so right away I have a bunch of enemies. So, but we have to stand somewhere on our principles. If we don't have some principles, what do we have? Barbarism? Now, we've seen some of that in the news. People getting carried away rather than focusing on a legislative system that we use to keep from war is basically what our system does. to try to protect us from criminals and invasion from outside of our nation. That has some to do with the border. So being conservative can mean that you don't want to change, but what does that mean? What do you want to? You don't want to change from what? Or change to what? And so it becomes a matter of semantics. I consider myself conservative, but being a conservative is based on probably a biblical perspective, which I believe goes back to the beginning of the existence of the universe. That things are established by God, and those are the things that we should pursue. So if you wanted to call me a conservative in that area, it would be biblical. My biblical interpretation of the world around me and the universe. I'm a conservative on believing that it's true what the Bible says, but I need to study it and learn from it all the days of my life. I guess if that's when you could call me conservative. But I'm also liberal in the sense of looking for better ways to live, better ways to lead, always changing and learning where I can. So in that sense, I'm a liberal, and some would call that classic liberalism maybe, but I'm supposed to be talking about being conservative, so tried to stay to the point on being conservative. So when you use the word, think about it. What does it mean? Is it really what you mean when you're saying somebody's conservative? So next time, talk a little bit more about the liberal, what liberal means. So this is Tim Linsdau. Like and comment on my video, and please subscribe. Have a great day. Thank you.